Hello, welcome to this little series of videos on the history of the English language. In this episode, I will be speaking about the Old English period from a historical linguistics informed point of view. So, what do we need to know about the Old English period as a period in the history of the English language? First off, I would like to distinguish between external and internal history. External language history is what Smith defines as the changing functions of the vernacular of the spoken language in relation to other languages and or in relation to broader developments in society, technological developments, political events, and so on. Whereas internal language history is what he defines as the changing forms of the language itself. So when we talk about language history, we can make this distinction. On the one hand, we can be speaking about the history of the language itself as a language. So what was Old English like? And on the other hand, we can be speaking about language history as it relates to general history. In this video and in the videos to follow, I will be always sort of doing both. That is jumping back and forth between the two. So looking at events that occurred, conquests, innovations, and so on, and thinking about how this influenced the language, as well as looking a little bit at the language itself and the things that were taking place within the language. So this means that we will be looking at statements like these. The word nice meant something like foolish in Chaucer's time, or something like the K in words like night or knife used to be sounded. These would be purely language internal statements, so internal language history statements. And we will also be looking at things like this, second bit of statements down there. Following the Norman conquest, English took over a lot of words from French, or with the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England, English started to become a historical language. These would be external language history statements. Okay, and we'll kind of be doing both here. Okay, so beginning with the language itself, what you see in black on white here is the history of English as we divide it up into different periods. So the historical period, the Old English period runs from the 5th century up until the middle of the 12th century AD. After that, we have Middle English from around 1150 until around 1500. And then we have Modern English after 1500. Modern English is subdivided into Early Modern English and Late Modern English, or just simply Modern English or Present Day English. The Old English period, as you can see, runs from 450 or so until 1150 or so. Of course, if you look into different books, you will always get slightly different numbers. It's all a little bit arbitrary too. So these are much later categorizations there, of course. The end of the Old English period is marked by an absence of English texts. English text production came to a screeching halt in the year 1066 when the Norman conquest of England occurred. The Norman conquest means that for about 100 years, beginning in the middle of the 11th century, there were no new English texts being produced because England was now being ruled by a French-speaking, old French-speaking ruling class. And so the people in charge of producing texts, copying texts, and so on were mostly French speakers. And so the texts that come down to us are not really English from this time. But the Old English period is a very long period. So it runs from the 5th until, as I said, the 12th century, with the very first bit there called prehistoric English. And prehistoric basically means that we don't have any written evidence yet. We don't really have historical sources yet from before the Christianization of Britain. Yeah, okay, I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. Before the Anglo-Saxons, that is the people who were speaking Old English, before they actually came to England, we have Celtic speakers in the British Isles. Celtic speakers probably came to Britain already at the end of the second millennium BC, right? So thousands of years earlier, we have Celtic invasions taking place. And in this time, in the time period of Celtic Britain, we also have another force that plays an important role, and that's the Romans. So Celtic Britain was under Roman rule, or part of Celtic Britain was under Roman rule from, let's say, the middle of the 1st century AD until the beginning of the 5th century AD. So for almost 400 years, the southern part of Britain was actually called Britannia and was ruled by Romans, was considered to be part of the Roman Empire. Round about the middle of the 5th century, as you already saw on the previous slide, the Germanic conquest of the British Isles began or started happening. The traditional date given for the very beginning is the year 449. We're not going to go into very great detail about any of this right now. Just keep in mind that the Germanic conquest of the British Isles is what, begins the history of the English language as the English language. We're sometimes given maps like these in books. This one is coming from David Crystal's Encyclopedia of the English Language, where you see where these Germanic-speaking tribes came from that then went to Britain. So we're talking about Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and Frisians, probably. And this is what happened. So we have speakers of West Germanic, languages that we could call Old Low German, Old Frisian, Old Saxon, settling over to what is today England, and this process beginning in the middle of the 5th century AD. The other languages you see here are other Germanic languages that were spoken in these regions at that time. A lot of what we know comes from one source, namely the Venerable Bede. Bede was an early Anglo-Saxon scholar. So he himself was an Anglo-Saxon. It's kind of interesting, but he wasn't writing in Old English, yet at the time he was writing in Latin. So his Latin name is Beda Venerabilis. And the traditional view that goes all the way back to Bede is that in the year 449, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, and probably Frisians, started populating Britain, with the Celtic tribes who were already living there gradually retreating to other parts of Britain, like Wales, Ireland, or Scotland, which are, by the way, also the parts of Britain where Celtic languages still survived or survive into the modern time, and even across the Channel to Brittany. Right, so that's the most traditional view. However, this has been called into question in recent years. If you look into Peter Baker's Introduction to Old English, there on page 2, he already says that the most recent genetic research on living people in the British Isles today suggests that most Celts actually remained where they were and just eventually adopted what he calls Germanic ethnicity, which means sort of becoming integrated into or subjugated by the Anglo-Saxon society and switching over from speaking Celtic to speaking Germanic. So it might not have been quite as bloody as the more traditional picture suggests. Yeah, I took this picture in Cornwall. You still see traces of early language contact all over England. So, for one thing, this street sign in Cornwall today is bilingual, right? So you see English at the top, Cornish at the bottom, so you can see the sort of Celtic language, the not so important, the secondary nature of Celtic there. Excuse me. Another thing that you see is some Latin influence on the vocabulary of both English and Celtic. So, for example, the word street is a very early borrowing from Latin. So you can also see there that parts of the infrastructure were already influenced by the Romans. Okay. This gives us the following situation. We have up to 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and their names are Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. By the way, the names of some of these kingdoms also derive from the names of the tribes that you just saw a few slides ago. East Anglia, the Angles, for example, right? Essex, Sussex, and Wessex, the Saxons. And it's interesting because we as linguists can also distinguish different Old English dialects just using the surviving text material from different regions. But I'm going to talk more about the regions in a moment. But we have 4 major Old English dialect areas that we can more or less distinguish from each other. So we have Northumbrian Old English coming from the far north. Northumbrian means north of the River Humber. We have Mercian Old English coming from those middle regions. Northumbrian and Mercian together are sometimes referred to as Anglish. No, sorry, Anglian. Anglish is something different. Anglian Old English would be the cover term for both Northumbrian and Mercian Old English. And then you have West Saxon Old English in the south, and Kentish as well. It's interesting that the Anglo-Saxons themselves referred to themselves as Angles. So they called their language English and their country Englaland, the land of the Angles. So this is actually where we get the words English, England, and so on. Excuse me. So let's just have a look at these 4 Old English words, and I'll just read them out to you right now. Ac means also. Riche means kingdom or reign. Herre means army, and lede means people. Now, do these 4 words show you something? Well, they should show you, for one, that Old English still had a lot of vocabulary that no longer exists in present-day English. That should be clear because these words, you don't recognize them from modern English. Now, if you know any other Germanic language, then this little list of words might also demonstrate something else to you. So, for example, if you know modern German, then you will see that Old English apparently was a Germanic language because the material, in terms of words that don't survive into modern English anymore, well, maybe they have cognates, maybe they have related expressions in other Germanic languages. So if you think of this list of German words here, German auch, corresponding to Erk, a German Reich, corresponding to Riche, and German Heer, corresponding to Herre, and German Leute, corresponding to Old English Lede. So you see that a lot of vocabulary is shared, for example, with present-day German. Okay, a tiny look at some very early Old English. This is an English text, believe it or not. It looks very, very foreign, particularly because it's written in runes, right? Using the runic alphabet there. So this is a little whalebone box that is known as the Franks casket today. It's very beautiful. It's carved on all sides. You have these carvings. And this is the front panel that you see here. Fun fact, you could carve runes either from left to right or from right to left. You just have to mirror reverse the runes if you write from right to left. So what you see down here is actually mirror reversed. So it runs from right to left. If we set it into the order that we're used to, and namely from left to right, we end up with this text. And by the way, these runes are all very angular looking, right? They're made up of more or less straight lines mostly. Why is this? Well, it's because runes were carved, right? They were carved not only into whale bones, but probably a lot more often into wood, into stone, into hard material. And it's harder to carve something round or curvy into hard material. That's why they consist of these straight lines mostly. Okay, so it's a very recognizable script, right? If you've seen the runic script before, it's kind of what it always looks like. Now you can directly transliterate runes into Latin letters, or I say insular letters here because the insular alphabet is basically the Latin alphabet that the Anglo-Saxons were using with some small additions to it. So some of the letters here are not really Latin letters in the truest sense. But these insular letters here, another little fact that maybe not many people know is that runes, in most cases, just stand for sounds. Okay, so the runic alphabet was a, phonemographic alphabet where every rune stood for a sound. So you can directly transliterate runes into Latin letters like here. It's still very hard to read like that. If you take this line, it's actually a line of Old English verse. And if you set it off as Old English verse and maybe replace a few of the letters here and there, you end up with this little text, which reads, Warth gas rich grorn, verhe on gret yiswom. Okay, gas rich is hard to translate because it's a hapax legomenon. That means it's a word that only occurs one single time. So it's almost impossible to know what it means. But for our purposes right now, we can maybe say creature. So Warth gas rich groen, the creature, the something became sad. Verhe on gret swam, where it swam onto grit or onto sand. And what is the meaning of this line? Well, it's part of a mini riddle in a way. So these runes have been carved onto a whalebone box, right? And so the answer to the riddle, a creature that becomes sad when it swims onto the sand, is, well, you are, as you're reading this, you're holding the answer to the riddle in your own hands, right? So you're holding a box that was carved out of the bones of a whale, out of a bone of a whale that got stranded. Okay, that was just a tiny look at a very early Old English text. Now, before the Christianization, the Anglo-Saxons had a predominantly oral culture. I like to call it a campfire culture because that's probably where most of the literary transmission took place, orally in the form of telling stories about ancestors, about heroes of the past, and these kinds of things. There are only very few of these runic inscriptions that we find from early Anglo-Saxon England, only something like 100 or so of these micro texts. Most texts are really not very long. They're like either just one word in length or a couple of words, like you just saw, but not really very informative texts that tell us anything about the time. Some of them are hard to read. Some of them are very difficult to interpret. It even seems to be the case that sometimes they would just use runes for decoration. So sometimes they didn't really mean anything at all, apparently. Or what you see here is a Futhorc inscription. Futhorc is just another word for the runic alphabet, named after the way you would have to pronounce the first letters in this runic alphabet. So the first letter stands for the sound f, and the second one for u, and the third one for th, and so on, right? So if you read it out, it's like Futhorc. Those are the first 6 letters of the runic alphabet. And so, for example, here on this blade, you just simply have the alphabet carved there for whatever reason, right? Open to your interpretation why somebody carved the runic alphabet onto this blade. Okay, then from the late 6th century, actually from the 590s on, we have missionaries being sent from Rome, but also at the same time, missionaries coming in from Ireland. It's also kind of a fun fact, 2 different forms of Christianity are coming into Anglo-Saxon England around about the same time from different directions. But the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon begins, let's say, around the year 600 or so, and it takes roughly 100 years before all of Anglo-Saxon England is then officially Christian. This means that in the long run, the campfire culture, the oral culture of the pagan Anglo-Saxons is being replaced by a monastic culture. That is, we're now looking at texts that are written in monasteries on dried and stretched animal skins, which are then bound together into books that we call manuscripts. Monasteries were the centers of culture, of this literary culture transmission, and of learning. A lot of, well, probably just young men in most cases, a lot of young men are there and are learning how to read and write, which actually means learning how to read and write Latin most of the time. So literacy is becoming a bit more common than it was earlier on. We've started finding the first Old English manuscripts from about the 8th century on. And you should still keep in mind that Latin is the predominant written language at the time. This also means that written Latin is starting to influence written Old English already, because a lot of the earliest Old English texts that we have are glosses. Glosses means that somebody took a Latin text, which was already there on the page, and sort of made a word by word by word by word translation between the lines of that same text into English. Maybe in order to be able to read the Latin text a bit better, right? Maybe just sort of for vocabulary help or something like that. But the resulting text is a gloss. It's a glossed text, which means it's a word by word by word translation from Latin. And you might already think, okay, this will probably mean that the earliest Old English texts that we have, either because they're direct translations or even glosses or something like that, might not really be what the Anglo-Saxons spoke like, but it might be very much imitating the original Latin, or being sort of modeled on the way written Latin works. Okay, another language we have to mention here is Old Norse. Old Norse is another Germanic language spoken by another set of pagan Germanic speakers at the time. So from the late 8th century then, Vikings, as we call them today, or as they came to be called, started raiding the east coast of England first, and this is also the beginning of the Viking Age. In England, this means it's mostly Danes attacking the east coast of England. What they do at first is they come and attack monasteries. Of course, this is where the culture is taking place. This is where all of the expensive books and other things are laying around, treasures, gold, and so on. And they pillage monasteries along the coast and then leave again. This goes on for decades. A generation or two later, they start staying for the winter, and then again a generation or two later, they start actually settling in that part of England and even conquering some of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. At one point, the kingdom of Wessex, the kingdom in the southwest, is the only one that really remains an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and it's King Alfred, Alfred the Great, who fends off the Vikings successfully. And in 878, there's a peace treaty between King Alfred the Great and King Guthrum of the Danes. And within this peace treaty, it says, for example, that the Danes will now also become Christians. And it also says that they are allowed to settle in a part of England. And this part is known as the Dane Law. So the Dane Law is not a law, it's a region in England where the where the Scandinavian settlers are allowed to settle peacefully. And this region is really interesting linguistically because the Norse spoken by, well, the Viking invaders and their descendants, this other Germanic language is now there, and it's probably starting to mix to a great extent with the Old English, with the, well, mostly Anglian Old English that is being spoken in those regions. So it's the region that is sort of shaded in purple here on this little map that you see there. Another thing that's interesting is that you can still see traces of this Danelaw region in England today. So for example, if you just look at the place names in this region, so what you see here is a picture taken of a signpost in northern Yorkshire. And there you have a lot of B's, that little element B at the end of place names. You might also think Rugby, for example, would be another one that's very famous. Grimsby, Skewsby, and so on. And there's also other place name elements that derive from Old Norse and not from Old English. Another thing is family names. So, and this has become very, very widespread in English for some reason, but the fact that a lot of English family names end in son, like in Johnson, Jackson, and so on, is also a feature of the way the Scandinavians were sort of using, well, family names or something similar to that. What else do you find? You find a lot of traces of Old Norse in today's English, generally speaking, in the core vocabulary of English today, in the most frequently used vocabulary. So you have some very frequently used nouns in English today, nouns like bag or cake or egg or kid or root, which are derived from Old Norse, not from Old English, as you may expect them to be. This even includes body parts like neck or skin or leg. There's also some very frequent adjectives like weak or low or flat that we get from Old Norse. There's also even some very frequent verbs like to get, to give, to take, and to want that are derived from Old Norse. And most extremely, most unusually, we even have some grammatical words, some closed class items like the third person plural pronouns, they, their, them, that come from Old Norse, as well as the word though, and even a form of to be, the form are. So if you say they are, you are using words that don't come from Old English, but that come from Old Norse. Really interesting. How can two languages influence each other, or how can a language influence another language on this level, to this degree, even bringing in grammatical words that almost never happens if you're looking at borrowings and which words are typically borrowed from one language to another. It just shows you how closely related Old Norse and Old English were. So these people were probably understanding each other quite well, and it just seemed very natural to them to start mixing their languages in that way. Okay, moving on to external language history a little bit more. I already mentioned King Alfred, the King of Wessex, who resisted the Danes towards the end of the 9th century. Here's a statue of him. Wessex was then the only remaining great Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Wessex also then took part in larger developments that were going on in Europe at the time. King Alfred himself was an educational innovator. And so he wanted to reintroduce learning, schooling, education to England. He wanted more people to be able to read and write in Latin again, and also to make translations, to make sort of fresh English translations of the most important Latin texts once more. The Benedictine reform was going on. Monasteries were becoming a big thing again. And this big revival of learning took place then over the course of the 10th century. Baker points out that the Old English speech community, the Anglo-Saxons, were one of those who produced an exceptionally large amount of texts at the time. They produced a lot of vernacular literature for us to read today, and as he says, at a time when relatively little was being written in most other languages of Western Europe, apart from Latin, of course. Mostly texts were being written in Latin. But if you look at languages that were not dead languages, but that people were actually using, other Germanic languages, for example, you often don't really find a lot of texts from this period. So there are more Old English texts. There's a larger text corpus of Old English texts than there is, for example, of Old High German texts from this time. So sort of interesting to know. Most Old English texts that we have today that we can open up and read today are coming from this period, from the 10th and early 11th century, and most surviving Old English texts are actually from Wessex. This may also be considered to be a reason why we sometimes learn late West Saxon Old English as the form of Old English today, as the sort of standard form of Old English, and we sort of disregard all of the other dialects that were there. So here's one particular late West Saxon Old English prose text. It's from the beginning of a letter, sermon, written by a person whose name we know. That's also kind of an exception. His name is Wulfstan, and he's writing a text that has since been called Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, the Sermon of the Wolf of Wulfstan. That's how he's calling himself in Latin, to the English. And he writes in Old English, Leven men, je knawath that soth is. This world is an ofste, and it nalachth tham ende, and thu it is on worlde a swalenge swawurze. So this might look very foreign to you right now. I can gloss the text for you so that you know what it understands. And once again, if you know German, you might recognize a little bit if I tell you that Leven men means dear men, dear people, actually. So that's a very bad gloss there. Dear readers, dear people. Leven, you might know the German word for how to begin a letter, right? Liebe, so Liebe. That's kind of the same, or the related German word there. Okay, actually I can take away some of my glosses because a small proportion of words have not really changed that much, but still I need to probably gloss much more than half of the words here for you to be able to understand them, right? So Leven men, dear people, Yeknawath that soth is, understand that which true is, that which is true. This world, is on ofste is in haste, and hit nalacht tham ende, and it nears the end, and so on. Yeah, okay, that's just to give you a first little impression of what the Old English prose style language was like that we find. And I'd like to sort of conclude now with just some basic facts about Old English. So what can we learn from this little video? Firstly, the Old English vocabulary is mostly Germanic. There were only a few borrowings from Latin in the language at the time, for obvious reasons. Modern English core vocabulary goes back to Germanic. Modern English core vocabulary, that means the most frequently used words that we find in English today are exactly these words. So they're the Germanic words. Old Norse, I also mentioned as having an influence on English in the long run. In the Old English time, you can't really see it yet because the influence was taking place in the north, and it was taking place in the spoken mode and not in the written mode, because Vikings and the descendants of Vikings then didn't write down their language yet. But the Old Norse items that we have there don't really change the fact that this is still, even in that region, a Germanic language. So Old Norse words are also Germanic words. Most Old English texts that we have today are written in the West Saxon dialect. So we have late West Saxon Old English as the most dominant form, the most typical form of Old English today. And Old English texts are mostly written in the Latin alphabet and not in the runic alphabet. Right? Latin alphabet, I called it the insular script as well, because there are some letters in there that don't really exist as such in the Latin alphabet. Okay, here are my references, and I am going to end this video now and hopefully see you around for the next parts.